Thank you for finding the NSE podcast on YouTube. To find links for our online hospitality security training, check out the video description below. Enjoy the Nightlife Security Podcast.
Welcome to the Nightclub Security Podcast, a professional resource for the nightclub security industry. Whether you're a nightclub bouncer, guard, owner, or operator, this is the podcast for you. We're here to inform, educate, and entertain. Let's get started.
Welcome, everybody. You listen to the Nightclub Security Podcast. This is your host, Manny Marquez. I'm here with nightclub security industry expert Robert C. Smith. Good afternoon, Robert.
How are you, buddy?
I've been better, thank you.
Well, that happens. Friends come in from out of town. You want to hook them up in San Diego, show them around town, and this is the result.
Yes, I have a buddy who is getting married this weekend, and so we have some friends in town, and decided to do some pre-celebration last night. So I'm, as they would say, a little rough around the edges today, but I'll be all right.
Yep.
So Robert, you're just getting back from Washington, D.C. How was your trip?
Great trip. The flight was good there. The flight was good back. The hotel was phenomenal.
Didn't you tell me you yelled at a little kid on the plane?
You know what? I had to yell at his dad. It's not the kid's fault. They're 4. What are they supposed to do? For those of you listening, remember what I said in training. Puppies and children. A drunk's job is to get drunk and be stupid. What's a kid's job in sitting behind you in a plane?
To kick the back of the chair.
And that's what this little bastard, this wonderful kid was doing.
I just can't believe you yelled at the kid.
I yelled at his dad. Hey, would you mind stopping your kid from kicking the chair? Oh, I'm sorry, Johnny, don't do it. Hey, Johnny, don't worry, buddy.
Very inappropriate on the flight.
It's not your fault, Johnny. Dad, control your kid,
I
please.
bet the whole plane was uncomfortable.
Good. I've been with kids before. This is not a bad thing for the kid. The kid's got to do that. That's what he's supposed to do, and Dad's supposed to teach him.
Beyond the kid kicking the back of your chair in the plane, how was the trip out there?
The training event was great. A lot bigger crowd than I had expected. We had about 15, 16 pre-registered people from a lounge out there called Capital. I think it used to be called Club 13, but they've changed and done some build-out and sent all their guys to it. But we had a lot of attendees from another couple of groups there. Law Society, Rock and Roll Hotel, Local 16, Wonderland Ballroom. There was one other group, Tropicalia.
I keep hearing that name, Wonderland.
You know what? I asked them if they were affiliated in any way with the Wonderland Gentlemen's Club in Miami, and he laughed and he said he could only imagine and wish. So they're not.
Because we actually have a Wonderland here in the San Diego area.
There you go. Beach. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it seems to be a name that people are using for whatever reason.
So we ended up having about 30 people. Made some great contacts, and it just happened the last day, my Wednesday there, I was at the beverage control hearings, and lo and behold, the owner of Capital, who had sent his people to the class, was there to just give the board members of the ABC division an update on what they'd been doing since they had a small event a few weeks earlier. They had a small issue arise at their club where the police were called, the investigators were there, and in D.C., the board members just like to be updated on what are you doing to proactively prevent these type of issues. We'll hit on this same topic in our news story in a second, but it's important you understand that even in your own city or your state, if they don't require you to examine a fight, a stabbing where someone gets hurt, you should do it anyway so you can try to think proactively, how can we prevent this in the future?
Yeah, oftentimes when an incident arises at a bar, the local law enforcement and ABC will ask a bar to put together an action plan to remedy or to improve the situation. So oftentimes ownership and management come to the conclusion that perhaps training is in line.
And that's
additional training.
And that's what happened here. Now, they didn't order him to get training, but he voluntarily said he would
basically being proactive and trying to still remain in the good graces and do the right thing.
Well, and what really worked out well for us and the company is that he couldn't fully explain what his people had been through, and I happened to be in the same room. So they invited me up to give the board a 5 or 10 minute pitch on what we did with the training, the topics. It segued into our online training for his new hires, the topics contained and how well our training is, and well received it is nationwide. So it was nice that happened on that last day I was there. So overall, it was a very productive trip.
It's good. Good to have you back, Robert.
It's good to be back.
You know what? I also wanted to mention one. We had a nice Facebook post from one of our students in the Florida area, Brian.
Yeah, Brian David out of Orlando at the Beecham.
I think you should read that to the listeners.
Brian works at the Beecham, also right next door, their secondary place called Social. Both music venues, live music venues, and Beecham is fairly large. Social is a little more intimate, but Brian works there. And his note, here it is, I learned so much from your class, can't wait to put some of that info into work at the Beecham, Orlando, Florida. So thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. And those kind of comments you don't understand. As an instructor trying to really make change in our industry, those kind of comments from Brian or anyone else to me really hit home, and it really makes me feel good that the message I get out there, trying to get out there, is hitting home.
Yeah, I think that the neat thing with the training is that when people complete it or as they go through it, you really are able to take a lot of information and you get a lot of what we call some additional tools in your tool belt to be able to use from night to night. And so it is nice that people are able to take this information, apply it to help them do their job better. So, Brian, we thank you for the comment. And
the other thing about that, though, Manny, is what still amazes me. Even in D.C., there was a guy with 21 years of experience, and he was the first guy at the end of the training on Tuesday night to be there to shake my hand and say he was a little apprehensive coming into this on Monday night when we started the training session, but after the first 6-hour day, the second 5.5, 6-hour day, he was glad that he was, quote unquote, volunteered by his owner to go, and he's going to have the rest of his staff attend. He just readily admitted, even though I've been in it over 20 years, I thought I knew more of this stuff, and I don't.
Yeah, and we've talked about that before, how, even guys with 15, 20 years under their belt as far as experience, people are able to come away from the training with more information and more confidence to do their job. So it really is a neat thing to see.
Yeah, thanks again, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And if there's any other students out there that have gone through our program, we'd love to hear from you on our Facebook page. So please do that for us. The news. Robert, what do we got in the news?
As I just said, it kind of segues. I didn't know it would segue as we were discussing it until right now. But this club in Pennsylvania is being sued. They had a stabbing, and I was just thinking right now. That's why I was hesitating. I was going to mention the name, but I'm going to leave them out. They're closed now. When they had this stabbing that is leading to the lawsuit we're going to talk about, a month later they had another one, and they decided this was enough, and they closed. Now you would think, well, wait a minute. They had a stabbing. They're being sued.
Did it say that they voluntarily closed, or were they closed down?
They voluntarily closed.
Gotcha.
But listeners, don't think they just had two major events and decided to throw in the hat. There are allegations in this lawsuit and that's why we're going to talk about it, that the family of the deceased person who was stabbed outside the front door of the club, within close proximity of the front door, immediately after closing. So imagine the scene. The bar closes down, and we'll use a 2 a.m. time frame. The crowd is pushed out the door, and outside the door, there's an argument, a scuffle, and a stabbing where the victim was stabbed 4 times, once to the heart, and he died there at the scene. The family of the deceased guest is suing the bar, claiming that they should have put in reasonable security measures to protect the guest or the victim or their family member. Now, there are some things in the legal side of this, and again, as we told you, a few months ago in our Liability podcast, we're not attorneys, but there are some very basic tenets in our industry that you have to know about, whether you're an attorney or not. One of those tenets is if you could have prevented something and did nothing to prevent it, you open yourself up to more exposure liability-wise. If you have a history of problems at your bar, and that history can be proven, and you did nothing to stop that history of bad incidents, you're even under more scrutiny and have more exposure. And that indeed is what the family is suing for. I think the comment from the father was, this club was a breeding ground for violent incidents. And if that bears out through police calls for service, police testimony, prior incidents, then this bar or their insurance company is in big trouble to lose this lawsuit or settle it at some large amount for the deceased family the victim.
And I think during the training, when we deliver that information, one of the lines that's used is there's reasonable expectation that you maintain a safe environment for your guests and your employees.
And remember, it doesn't just go for the four walls of your club or bar. This also extends to any area surrounding your club that can be reasonably connected. So would that mean your entryway line? Would that mean your own parking lot? And in this case, the close proximity sidewalk to your venue as people are leaving and milling about, having a cigarette, collecting phone numbers, saying goodnight. There's absolutely a reasonable expectation that your guests leaving your venue should be safe.
That word reasonable is a word that's often used within a courtroom. And the reason why it's used is because it allows the interpretation of either the judge or the jury of what would be, I guess, the common sense.
And remember what we talked about, Manny, at our podcast, and you've heard this before. For those of you listening, in America, it's a jury of, finish that sentence,
Your
Manny.
peers.
A jury of your peers. Remember, if you haven't downloaded our Liability podcast 1 and 2, please do so you'll really understand this. You don't get a jury of your peers, bartenders, bouncers, managers, owners. These people are in bed by 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. They don't understand what you or your staff has to deal with. So it's what's reasonable to them, a normal, prudent, reasonable person, not a bar worker. That doesn't count here. So would it be reasonable to any other person in a walk of life that is not a bar to think that their premise should be safe? Of course it is.
And the defending attorney for the bar had an interesting comment that you mentioned. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, he's it's his job. He's got to look for these things to try to defend the club to limit and lower that potential loss from the lawsuit. He said that the bar didn't have any reasonable knowledge that a third party coming onto the premise would lash out in that violent manner. And I'm not, this is not an exact quote, but what he's saying is we run the club. Should some random guy come into our club and cause violence, we have no control over that. And your first comment when I read his comment was what, Manny?
I mean, you do have.
You absolutely do. You control who comes in and out of your club at the door. You have the ability to screen them. You have the ability, if you know you might have trouble, depend on your neighborhood, what your show is, what your music is, what your clientele is, and how many incidents you've had in the past. You've got every ability to conduct pat-downs, even to the point of empty pockets, screening people. And this is another subject, but I'm telling you, any bar in the United States of America can pat down their guests. Well, we don't live in a police state. I don't want to scare off my customers. People will go to a place where they feel safe. And if you've got a history of violence, it's just a matter of time before you have more violence.
And just to touch on one more point, if you have a history of violence, and then that other important word comes into play, foreseeability, and an owner having knowledge that there is a history of problems and likely that something will happen in the future. So that's an important point as well.
And so you fully understand this, and I know it kind of makes it seem insignificant, but this is almost the same type of standard that they judge you for spills, a water spill, a lime wedge on the floor. Is it reasonable for employees to pick up a lime wedge or to quickly stand over a water spill until they can get the little yellow sign and a mop? Is that reasonable, man?
Very reasonable.
Why?
To prevent injuries.
And how do you know that, man? Have you ever slipped on a lime wedge, Manny?
I have, yes.
Have you ever slipped in a puddle of water?
Yes.
And I bet most of our industry has.
Banana peels.
And well, you probably should lift those banana peels up when you're making banana daiquiris or banana martinis.
I used to work at a coconut bar in the Caribbean, and that was our specialty.
All right. Okay.
All right, back to the point, though.
Just remember, when you're trying to wrap your head around this, is why would the bar be liable for somebody coming in? It's the same reason. If you should have known that people would slip in a water pool and you cleaned it up and you do that on a regular basis, if you have violence, you're going to have more if you don't address it somehow.
So the lesson to learn from this story is,
if you think you're going to have problems based on your history, try to limit the damage by not continuing with the issues that you didn't address.
And what's a good first step?
Training. Train your staff what to look for and what to do at the door, what they can and cannot do.
One other point that I wanted to make with this story is, I mean, if we don't know if it's going to go to trial, probably won't, but I'm guessing settlement.
Yeah.
Normally these things don't ever see the inside of a courtroom because both sides know that it's going to be more expensive to litigate a case like this rather than just to settle. So I think probably there's some posturing from the defense just to limit exactly how much that settlement is. So any other comment on it, Robert?
No, just remember that there's people judging you all the time, and you're always liable.
All right. So today's main topic for today's podcast is use of force. And this is actually the second part of a 3-part series. Robert, you actually had a article that was published in Bar Biz magazine in the month of February. And
the editor, Chris Udarte, he jumped on this in a second when I explained that he asked for a simple article. And I said, what about this idea? Let's tie it in with your February article as part 1. We'll do our podcast and our blog as part 2. And we'll wrap it up with part 3 at the Nightclub and Bar Show in now another 10 days from now. And he was all over it. So the article's out there in Bar Biz magazine. It's barbizmag.com. We'll have a link on the show notes. It's and his opening line here is, it's under the how-to section in his magazine, but it's in part 1 of this special 3-part multimedia series. And I think that really is different.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever read that before, of a 3-part multimedia series, because that's what I wanted to do.
So this is actually, like I said before, this is part 2 of that, and that's the podcast. So we'll be talking about use of force. We'd like for you to stick around, and we'll be right back after the short break. If you like our show, visit nightclubsecurity.com for more information and access to free resources. And welcome back, Robert. As we said before the break, today's podcast is about use of force, or understanding legal use of force. And as we stated, this is part 2 in a part 3 series. Part 1 being the article that was just published in February, an article of yours called...
What'd they call it? May the force be with you?
Yeah, they used a little Star Wars reference.
Way to go, Chris. Chris, nice job there, or editor.
And so how did you want to start off this topic?
Well, just make sure, I wanted to reiterate, number 1, part 1 was in Bar Biz magazine, barbizmag.com. We'll have a show link for you. Part 2 is this podcast, show notes. And part 3 will be at the Nightclub and Bar Show, my live training session on Tuesday the 24th at 2:10 p.m. So if you're just listening and you didn't get part 1, go to the magazine. If you're going to go to the show, you get the wrap-up edition in person. So that's what I want to make sure everyone knows.
So hopefully we have some listeners going to the show, and we'd love to see you there.
And I know we do. I got comments in D.C. that they're going. In fact, the owner of Capital is going. He's coming to the session. I know one of his employees is going. I know a couple guys in Miami are going. So I know we're getting some people that are going.
Excellent. So to start off the topic, what's our jumping point here?
Well, okay. Part 1 in the series in the magazine, when you read it, you'll see that it's going to cover some of the reasons that I think, from my training and experience as a police officer, police detective, and doing this with so many clubs around the country, what are the reasons that employees use excessive force? And there's really one common theme, and that's the lack of training. So in that article, we talked about that. We talked about understanding who your main problems are in the bar world, and some thoughts and tools that you can use as a guard to not use excessive force. Part 2, which is what we're going to start discussing now, we're going to cover the criminal liability of using excessive force and some of the criminal things that can happen and have happened, the civil liability and how it would affect a guard or an owner, and a couple of proactive things that owners and managers can do. And finally, we'll hit you again with where to get part 3.
And just to kind of clarify for the listener, and we talk about this again in our civil liability podcast, which I'll go ahead and put a link up on our show notes, but let's explain the difference between the criminal liability and the civil liability.
And again, no legalese here, and I try to teach in a basic form where you understand it. You don't got to go looking for the meaning of words. So criminal liability, and we're talking about the guards here, criminal liability is where you break the law. You can get arrested. And arrested also means detained by the police, issued a summons or a citation, where you have to go to court or you plead guilty to some offense. That's criminal liability. Bars, entities, LLCs, there's no criminal liability there. That's where civil liability comes in, because they have a duty to provide reasonably safe environments, protect their guests, and you as a guard, although you could be criminally liable, you could create increased civil liability for your owner or the LLC or the company that is managing that bar. So civil liability mainly affects your owners. Criminal liability mainly affects the guard. But on occasion, civil liability can come over onto you, the individual guard, where you went beyond your scope, policies, procedures. You use excessive force in some manner, and oftentimes the plaintiff or the victim will go after you and the bar.
And so another point to make is another way to think about it is on the criminal side, you normally get a sentence of either probation, jail time, fines, combination of all three. And the civil liability side of it is normally a monetary settlement.
It is money.
So that's another way to think about it. So let's go ahead and dive into that.
Well, let's first understand the criminal liability. And it may seem pretty obvious to you, but there's a case that I'm working on now for a bar, and it's really funny because, I'll readily admit that I'm working on two cases, two different parts of the country. One, the guards did it absolutely correct. One, the guards did it absolutely wrong. And in both cases, criminal liability exposure was there. But in the second case where they did it right, nobody got arrested. In the first case where they did it wrong, two guys got arrested. They went to jail. Doorman, they went to jail. They eventually pled out after about a month and a half of wrangling. They pled guilty to simple assault. Now, the victim in that case ended up with a cracked skull from being pushed backwards by the guards at the door. Understanding that is a use of force. When you feel someone is in your space because they get close to you and you feel threatened and you put your arms out in an extended position to shove them backwards or move them out of your space and they fall, that's a use of force. Don't try to talk yourself out of it. It is what it is. Own it and move on. They had options. There's no problem with them stepping back. In the second case that I mentioned, those guards put their hands up, didn't touch the guest. They stepped back. There was no fear with these guys. They knew the guy might get aggressive, but they also knew what a drunk is supposed to do when they're asked to leave the bar. They're angry. They don't want to leave, so they're going to talk to whoever's in front of them, and they're going to get close to you. They don't hear you. They've got a little ringing in their ears. They're drunk. They have no balance. They stagger. They lean forward, and yes, they may get in your space. You don't need to lash out, especially if you understand that's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing sometimes how you see doorman interacting with a guest when they're drunk, and it's one of those things where the guard you have to take the higher road and dealing with them. And as far as when people are drunk, they're going to be wobbling into you. They're going to be talking in your ear. They're going to be loud. So all those things are part of the job, and it's our job as doorman, as security, as management, is you figure out how to cope with that sort of interaction. And there's no need to get aggressive or violent.
No, and anytime you're starting to lose control, you either step away yourself or someone should tap you on the shoulder and basically tap you out. But if you've got no one there, you've got no experience, you've got no tools on your tool belt to use as a guard. I've just seen it happen too many times where, bam, you think you're helping yourself and protecting yourself, and criminal liability arises because you just went too far.
A good tactic to use in those situations is, and it's something that we teach in the course, is if you're going into a situation that may potentially become violent or aggressive, we always teach to have at least two working the situation.
Try never to do something alone. Whether you know it's going to get violent or not, you just never know when it's going to erupt or when your number one guard will lose control.
So part of that reason is to have backup, somebody there that's going to be able to assist you. Another reason why you go in with two is if you feel yourself getting heated, losing control, and aggression, kind of welling up inside of you, is when either you step away and let the other person engage, your backup engage the individual. Or if you're the backup and you see that happening with your partner, you tap him out, and he now becomes the secondary individual on the situation.
The way Manny described it is exactly the way it should be. The hardest part of doing what he just described is doing it. You know, when I've described this in class, and I get the guys or even the women to talk openly, they don't want to do that. They don't want the perception of that they failed. They want to handle the problem. They aren't going to lose control, even though they're losing control. It's okay to admit it. You know, there's nothing wrong with saying that drunks sometimes piss you off. But if you know that and can admit it, it's okay to step back and let number two take over for you. There's no shame in that kind of play.
Yeah, and you know, I've even gone so far as to where I know I've been the primary contact, and the individual was getting heated to me. I've even gone so far as to take myself out of the picture, because I know that it's my face, my presence that's making the individual more aggressive, wanting to fight, wanting to lash out.
If you can remember the objective is the guest leaves, you are not arrested. That's what our objective is for this discussion we're talking about right now on criminal liability. No matter what the guy did inside. Look, if he was violent inside and he hit someone over the head with a bottle, different scenario. We know you're going to have to put your hands on him, whether you're detaining him or walking him out. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about where a guy is in your face being stupid at the door and you go overboard. The exposure is huge. Manny's giving you several good possible things to do other than lash out. Remove yourself, get tapped out, tap yourself out. Handle it differently so you don't open yourself up to that exposure of being arrested.
And the neat part about having those sorts of tools in place gives you the confidence to go in those situations and to be able to deal with them. And I think one of the things that happens to guards and managers is it's a fearful situation. You know, and we have that instinct of either fight or flight. But if you have those tools and knowing how you would handle a situation that's getting aggressive, it gives you more confidence to take care of it. You know, and that I'm going to come out of this situation safe and alive, and hopefully no one's going to get hurt.
And here's another part of this equation. How do you get a guy to understand this stuff? You put him in situations where they can succeed, they can fail, but as a senior guard or a manager, you're right behind your guy knowing what's going to happen with your contact. So let's just say I'm the junior guard. We're at the door. Manny's my manager. He's standing behind me by 5 feet. He's watching me handle this interaction. 99.9% of the time, the drunk is going to leave on their own. But if he starts to get the better of me, Manny can then, in this controlled setting, with a simple drunk, he can step in and take over and guide me and show me the right way to handle it, and I would step back. Then we talk about it, and next time, I go a step further. Manny's still behind me as my manager, and I'm handling this different customer, different night, but I'm getting to handle the same exact event, but I do it better. Maybe the third time, Manny he gets to walk away because he trusts me enough. He can sense the trust that I have in myself, and I handle that client correctly without losing my temper this time.
And another thing you should do is to talk these scenarios out with your team prior to anything ever happening. You know, make sure the entire team is on the same page as far as a point person, a cover person, and then, you know, either I'm going to step away if it's getting aggressive or I'm going to get tapped out.
That came up a couple weeks ago when I was in Miami, day 2 of a 2-day training for the Gentlemen's Club 11 in Miami. One of the guards came up to me before we started our day 2, and he said, "Hey, last night this happened." I said, wait. Don't be afraid to share this with your teammates. So we're at their club. We've got 40-something guards. He hadn't told anyone that this happened, not even his managers. So this was the first they're hearing of it. And what he said is just that. He said, as soon as this drunk started to get pissed off at me, I remembered what you said. He's just mad. He's not violent. He didn't do anything wrong other than violated our policy. We're going to ask him to leave. So I apologized to the guy. I said, hang on here just a minute. I stepped 3 feet away, called for another guard, got my manager to watch. I started talking to him. He was still angry. I had no problem in looking at my second guard, asking him to talk to the gentleman. When the second guard said hi, the guest changed immediately. The number one guard didn't take offense to it because the end result was no one had to put their hands on the guy. There was no violence, no overreaction by guards, and guard 2 got the guest outside and he left.
Yeah, it's one of those scenarios. I mean, we equate it to a good cop, bad cop, where generally the first person that makes contact with an individual in those situations normally becomes just by de facto the bad cop.
Yeah.
And it's the second guy on the scene who can be the softer, kinder, gentler guard who is going to help this guy find his friend, find his safe way out.
Now imagine if you practice this on a nightly basis, dude. I'm telling you, this is money in the bank on every level. If you go into this tonight and it's Friday night, granted for us it's Friday night, you're going to listen to it whenever, but you take this to work that night and you try it. Tell your partner, if you're working with one guy or 5 guys, pick your guy out that you work with the most and say, hey, tonight, watch my back and I'm going to watch your back. If you feel that you start to get a little bit over the top on this guy, look at me. That's our cue, and I'll take over. Let's practice it. Now, your partner may say, what the F are you talking about? I got this guy. That's when you learn there's no personal, problem here. We can both do it, and our end result is not to get arrested for it.
Yeah, and it's one of those practices where you're putting ego on the side, and again, the objective is everyone goes home safe, no one gets hurt. That's a good night.
And no one gets arrested.
So we kind of got off topic here.
That's criminal liability, though. We're all right, because we were going to talk about some things you can do later. We just covered criminal liability and some of the things you can do. The next part of the criminal liability one, though, let's go to the one that's actively...
Well, just recap.
Yeah.
Criminal. So...
Well, we're going to stay with criminal. I'm going to give them a more serious scenario.
Okay.
This was just the drunk in your face. The next one is the guy you got to put your hands on. He's thrown a bottle across the room. He's kicked his girl. He's kicked a guy, and you got to put your hands on him. Great. Put your hands on him. Take him to the ground. Remember, only the force necessary to stop the threat. Now,
say that again.
Only the force that was necessary to stop that threat.
One more time.
That's what you can use. You can use force, but only the force that was necessary to stop the threat.
And that's a really key phrase. That's and in the training, very important. And I want the listeners to think of this is that phrase, force only necessary to stop the threat. We say that because in front of a judge or jury, that's what they're going to be looking at.
That's what they're going to judge you on.
Yeah.
Did you use force? Yes. Can you legally? Yes. However, the force you used went well beyond what you needed to use. And I know you were pissed. He dropped an N-bomb on you. He called you fat, skinny, tall, gay, straight. It doesn't matter. You can only use the force that was truly needed to stop the threat, and you have to stop. You can't get that extra punch to the side because you're pissed off.
Or kicking the side.
Yeah. Or dragging them out in a headlock and throwing them out the door, and they tussle and fall and roll down the stairs. You can't do that.
Give them a couple more licks.
Remember, all of those things now open you up to criminal liability. Yes, you could lie, and some of you have done this. You have gone excessive force on someone. When the police finally came, you know what? I wasn't here. I didn't see it. Hey.
Yeah, he tripped.
Yeah, he tripped
on his way out the door.
Hey, bouncer, what happened?
New York accent.
Bouncer, what happened? This is what happened. Hey, drunk guest, you either leave or I'm going to arrest you because you seem to be the problem. And it never surfaces. I'm telling you, it's just better to operate when you're all protected, because if someone got that on video, if it's caught on another camera,
cell phone camera,
and you're now criminally liable for that guy, that douchebag that called you a name, you lost control and you get arrested. It's not fair. What tough shit. You don't like it, go be a barista. Go pump gas somewhere where you don't have that exposure. So remember, you can put your hands on people, but if you go overboard, and you can defend yourself, but if you go overboard, well, Robert, that's a thin line. I mean, yeah, you're right. No one said the job was easy. This is a very hard, dangerous job, and you've got to be able to think about it before you go too far. And if you do, I can't help you. You went too far. You knew it. Other people reasonably should have known, and you're going to get arrested. Sorry.
So I think the main part, Robert, on the criminal side is for guards to consider. This is the side of the use of force where you can be arrested and charged with assault or any other
personally accountable for your actions. Personally, what you did could have been prevented. You could have done something different. You are personally accountable and will go to jail.
So let's get into the civil side.
Again, try to listen to our podcast on liability, because we're just going to touch on it here. If you use excessive force, as we outlined on scenario 1 or scenario 2, the bar becomes even more liable. The bar is always liable. Your LLC, the bar you work for, is always liable.
And ownership.
The ownership is always liable. There's nothing you can do to close that liability window. But if you use excessive force, if you push a drunk, if you carry a drunk out and he gets hurt or she gets hurt, that bar is even more liable because you did it wrong or used excessive force. There are limits. We talked about them in the criminal side just a second ago. And the owner or that company must impose training requirements so you learn those limits. Because if you don't know them, you're going to go off. And now that opens up the owner's civil liability.
And normally on a civil lawsuit, typically a victim is not going to go after the guard themselves because the main objective is a monetary settlement. So I'm guessing a lot of guards out there aren't, millionaires, wealthy, but ownership has more resources and insurance policies. And that's typically where the civil lawsuit lies, is with ownership.
It's almost like the old phrase, the captain of the ship. The bar owner, no matter what kind of group or person owns it, they're the captain of the ship. They're home sleeping at 2 a.m. when you're putting your hands on a guy walking him out. They hope and expect that you do it right. But if you don't, they're still liable even though they weren't there. If an owner is liable because it's their company, it's their bar, I mean, imagine all the things you do on a nightly basis. They trust and hope that you do right. Well, if you're not nice to a guest, yeah, they may complain, but it's not going to cost them $1 million. If you don't let a guest in because their ID is not right or dress code isn't right, it's not going to cost them $1 million. But when you use force, and if you don't understand what legal use of force is, that is, to me, and I've said this for years, the most costly preventable loss within the hospitality industry. You have the ability to limit the damage by understanding, number one, you can use force, but you have to stay within a reasonable measure. And only the force that was necessary to stop that threat is reasonable.
And I think typically owners who find themselves in these situations where they're, they have a pending lawsuit or in the middle of litigation or negotiations for a suit, I think a lot of owners find themselves in situations where they really didn't think of something like this happening. Well, they don't think of the consequences for not properly training your guards.
Let me give you a new scenario, Manny, and I've heard this over the last 3 months. I've heard this twice from managers, and it really bothers me, and I'm going to put this out here. My philosophy is that if I train my guards, if I'm an owner and I train my guards to the best of my ability, and I get someone else, a company like my company, to come in, and these guards are all of a sudden better, well, they're going to be less likely to use excessive force. I've had managers tell me, Bob, our policy manual and our training is so small because our attorneys have said we need a little more plausible deniability. Now a manager can say, look, we told him not to use force, and he used force. We didn't want him to do that. That's not our fault. Well, it doesn't work like that, folks. You can't tell your guys, for example, one policy manual I read, they put in there specifically, never use force on a guest. Think about that, guards, managers. How can you ever have your staff live with that policy? Never use force.
Then the question is let's say somebody is acting violent to himself and to those around him, and your guards are just all standing there in a circle staring at him.
Because they were told.
They were told, no use of force.
Never.
So now you've done nothing, and doing nothing sometimes makes you liable.
You're even more liable. Yeah. It's a very, very slippery slope, thin ice, fine line. All those comments I get nationwide, they're true. I got nothing for you. It's true. It's a dangerous, difficult job to live in and work in. So either accept that responsibility, which is tremendous, or get the hell out. So civil liability is always there. You have the ability to lower the potential chance of a loss by not using excessive force. And how do we give our employees that now you threw me that softball before. How do we give our employees the best chance to cover our ass as owners or operators, Manny?
I properly train them.
Train them. If guards are trained, they're less likely to go too far. And
if they have an understanding,
correct.
They'll know what to do.
And here's the second part of that. One of the managers in DC said, Bob, this is like the third time in the last 6 years our guys have gone through your course, and each time it's a little bit different. But he said, I found that, and I teach this too, I found that when they do it wrong, we hold a quick meeting. I let everybody know that Johnny did this, and Johnny's off the schedule next week. Now, this is a men's club. They get tipped out. Johnny lost pay and tips for the next Friday and Saturday night because he didn't follow the policy that was given regarding walking a guest out, wrapping a guest up, documenting that use of force. He didn't follow the policy, and there's now a consequence to this guard. They were trained. They were given the opportunity to do it right. He made a mistake. He was disciplined, and he's back on the schedule. Now, we hope that Johnny gets the message and doesn't violate policy again.
He sounds like a good manager.
It's a smart manager.
Yeah.
Because you're looking at saving money, and I'm telling you, since we started working with Pike at HI Insurance, Hospitality Insurance Agency, looking at these loss runs of claims where they're holding in reserves waiting for a lawsuit to settle millions of dollars.
And basically for the listener, a loss run is basically settlements that an insurance company will have to pay out on an incident or a pending incident. So they basically, obviously keep track of all this, and they call that a loss run.
Have you had a chance to examine the numbers from violent incidents, inappropriate use of force by guards, as opposed to everything else? Have you looked at that?
Yeah. I mean, it's from the ones that we've had.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, there are lawsuits that we're not really touching on. Slip and falls, guest on guest, a piece of equipment breaks with a guest on it or something like that. What we're focusing on in this podcast are the force lawsuits from guards using excessive force. And looking at these loss runs from clubs, when guards lose their control and it turns into excessive force, it's just monumentally expensive, millions of dollars that this guard has in their hands and their ability to save or to lose.
It would be interesting industry-wide to find out some sort of estimation, a number of just how much insurance companies pay out.
It's a hard number to get.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any information
hopefully
out there.
We can get it from Pike sometime. But to put the last part of this discussion on the civil liability, the things you can do, we mentioned training, obviously. Have your managers involved. Role play training, 5-10 minutes. Hey, guards, what are we going to do when this happens? Okay, let's do it. Manager, when you see them not doing it during the real life scenario of the bar being open, go school them. Teach them right then. Document that you gave them instant training and move on. A discipline process when the guards use too much. It may be that you want to fire them. I've seen that too. If they're not going to learn and they're not going to listen and they're a hothead, get rid of them. Get someone in there who's better equipped mentally to handle the stress of dealing with these idiot drunks. Getting other good operators maybe to come in and talk to your staff about it. Maybe to get your insurance company to come talk to your staff about it. Once again, this surrounds training, but the more they hear it from different resources, the better equipped they are to understand it. And if they understand it, they'll handle it better.
Yeah, and owners need to expect that just to hire a guy and throw him on the floor just to be a warm body is probably one of the worst things you can do, because you really haven't established any sort of protocol, haven't introduced them to policies, procedures, haven't establish any sort of
nothing involving training or the hands-on part of the training that goes on. Don't think that we only offer classroom style and online training. When we go to a venue, I make sure that if we have the ability, I go into the venue and I'll take a very benign, simple contact, meaning there's a guy at the bar who the bartender's cut off. It was a friendly cut off. She's given him water. She's closed out his tab, but he just doesn't want to leave. And I'll take that scenario, and managers use this. Senior guards use this. Find your most junior guard, and I call them new booty. Find your new booty on your team, whether it's 4 months or 4 days, and say, okay, See him up there? We got to ask him to leave. Tell me what our policy is. Okay. Now tell me how we're going to handle this. And let the new booty handle this simple contact. Because if he learns the simple ways in a controlled setting with you watching, they'll be better later when the crap hits the fan.
Yeah, and it's a good point that the training needs to be continuous, and it should be something that is thought about by the supervisor and the management on a nightly basis. So, Robert, what else do we have on for our podcast as far as presenting this information? I know.
Well, to cover, and this is what this part is. Part 2 was this, nice and short and sweet, to cover what criminal liability is related to use of force, what civil liability is related to use of force. Give you some tools to put in your tool belt, some ideas about how to limit criminal liability, how to limit and eliminate civil liability, wrap it all up, and then finally give you kind of an outline of what our live session will be in Vegas. And for those of you that can attend the live session, well, get the magazine article, read it, listen to our podcast, and sorry, we got nothing for you. We're not gonna live broadcast part 3. It's kind of an attendance thing.
And so, real quickly, what is the outline for your Vegas presentation?
Part 3 will be some role play. We'll have a couple of people come out of the audience. We'll let a couple other people to talk to them and try to talk them down with no prior training. We'll just bring them up without any knowledge. Then we'll give them a little bit of a session, couple of ideas they can take back to their venue, and then we'll redo that same scenario and see if our blind attendees can come up and handle it correctly. We'll give them an outline of part 1 and part 2, and then some open discussion on, I had this happen in my club, what do you recommend? I had this happen in my bar, the police said this, what do you recommend? Because I think that really brings it home when they can talk about incidents, whether they're open lawsuit incidents or not, and they can see that maybe, they don't have to admit it, because I know people don't admit it all the time, that maybe their guards could have done something differently.
All right, Robert. Well, we're looking forward to Vegas and the presentation. I'd like to invite everybody just to stick around for the last part here. We're going to take a short break, but just stick around. We got some announcements to make, and we'll be right back. All right, everybody, and welcome back. Robert, we're going to wrap up today's show with a couple quick announcements. Obviously, we have the Bar Nightclub show coming up March 24th, 25th, 26th.
10 days from now, we'll be there. We'll get in on Sunday, the 23rd, set our booth up, and then Monday's a busy day for us, although there'll be some training sessions, and our session is on Monday at 2:10. Remember, that's part 3 of this wrap-up if you're in town and you've got the magazine and our podcast. But we'll be doing podcast interviews all day. We've got some really good people lined up from the industry, some real good experts. We're going to be talking to John Taffer also probably that Tuesday morning. But, John's been a longtime friend of the company, and I know he wanted to be involved in one of the podcasts, so I appreciate that. But we'll get him on board. We'll be in our booth on Tuesday and Wednesday nearly all day. We're trying to get Adam Carolla to stop by to talk about Mangria. We'll see if we can swing
I think we
that.
can still probably squeeze him on a podcast. I'm going to try.
Yeah. I think that might be cool too. Adam's one of the biggest podcasters in the world.
He is the biggest podcaster.
Yeah, then that means he is the biggest podcaster.
So yeah, and he's actually the keynote speaker as well for the nightclub and bar.
So that'll be, we'll be leaving town on Thursday, the 27th, and then within a week, I'm off to Kennewick, Washington, outside of Seattle for Jack Diddley's up there. Todd Jones, the owner, has brought us in for a weekend of training. That'll be a really intimate one, and I like doing those. Kind of gotten away from those, but I like doing them because I'll be able to go observe on Friday, train on Saturday, work with their guys on Saturday night, train on Sunday, and then get out of there on Monday. And that's up in Kennewick, Washington, at Jack Diddley's. And we got a local one.
Local one coming up. We have the California PSO. That's for the Proprietary Security Officers Certification and Licensing Process. We're going to be doing that at Typhoon Saloon in Pacific Beach. That is an open training that you can register for if you're here in the San Diego area. So we actually have a spot on our website for in-person training, and you can actually register just straight from our webpage.
We've got about 8-9 people already signed up for that.
Yeah. And then we are actually, I kind of jumped ahead, but the week prior we're going to be in Los Angeles area, and that's going to be this year April 9th, 10th, and 11th. That's a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. will be at Loaded in Hollywood, and we're going to be doing that in conjunction with our West Coast insurance partner, which is Cliff Ziegler and RPA, Restaurants Programs of America. So he's going to be helping us put that together.
And again, we're a month away from that. We already have 10 people signed up for that session too.
Yeah, we've got a couple good venues. Big Wangs is going to be participating. I'm sure we'll have some more guys from the 1933 group. So we're looking forward to our LA trip. I think that's about as far as what's on the calendar
Yep.
In the next few weeks. But again, all the information, you can find that on our website, nightclubsecurity.com. If you are on Facebook, why don't you find us on Facebook? And we're at Nightclub Security Consultants. Like us. You can follow us on Twitter at BouncerCoach. Also, if you are listening to this for the first time, if you are somebody who liked the material, found it interesting and useful, we'd really appreciate it if you pass this along to a friend, a coworker. We would really, really like to grow our audience.
And let me quickly say, I tried to find the kid's name from Club Space in Miami. The day I put up the first slide for training there for Space, he had downloaded our podcast. By the second day of training, which was 3 days later for them, he had already listened to the first 5 episodes.
That's awesome.
He was raving about it. He'd been in the industry for a while. And dude, I know you mentioned it, and I'm sorry I don't have your name, but I'm going to get it for the next podcast, and we'll do a shout out to you. So thanks for all your downloads, and thanks for your listening. And then you even said on day 2, you gave a shout out to me and the podcast to your group. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great to hear, having that sort of feedback directly for the podcast. And the great thing about podcasting and listening to podcasts is it really does give you a chance to exercise one of the most important muscles in your body, and that's your brain, to think about new ideas, new ways of approaching things, to have discussion points for you and your team. So this is really what we're trying to create here is a useful resource for you to use, to share. So on that note, please share us. We really appreciate it. And actually, you know what, Robert, I didn't tell you, but on the, like I've said before, we can see analytics of where we're getting downloads from different parts of the country or the world. We actually had about 34 downloads from a small island off the coast of China called Macau, Macua, I think is the way it was spelled. So somehow somebody found us out there.
There's probably a club, I'm betting.
Yeah.
And some bar owners out there. I would almost bet he's probably been headhunted away, and I'm just guessing on this, headhunted away from the States, searching the internet, found the informational podcast we have, and they're having their people listen to it.
Yeah, which is great. And another thing is every week, every podcast, we're getting more and more downloads, more and more hits, more and more people listening to the podcast. So we really do appreciate it, and help us grow this community. I think that's about it for today's show. Robert, thank you for your time. I got a wedding.
Manny, it's my pleasure.
I got a wedding I got to run to, so I got to get ready and get suited up. Not my wedding, by the way. That's about it for us today. I'm Manny Marquez.
I'm Robert Smith.
And be nice.